Yeah, thanks so much, Anna. So we asked our platforms what type of license they have, and then we went and looked at the answers and tried to group them into certain categories, because at that time we were primarily interested in what kind of national license they would have. Essentially, we looked whether or not there was a national license from non-financial authority or non-financial model license, or whether there was a rather like a traditional license for a traditional institution, or whether it was a bespoke crowdfunding license. What is quite interesting, I think, that we see a difference here between the equity and lending models. In equity, 89% of equities are unlicensed, and lending 31.3%. How can we explain this finding? We can see that the operation of the licensing and lending to some extent does not fall into the scope of the traditional financial institutions, and there's no bespoke crowdfund license or lending license in those countries. So that's why we have this high range of lending platforms which are unlicensed. When we look at the equity, what is quite interesting as well is that we have the bespoke national license and most as the predominant license for the equity type. The reason is very simple. In most countries, there's no crowdfunding license yet, and therefore they need to rely on that type of license. And lastly, in lending, we have with 25% most lending platforms using the traditional financial institutions license, as they mostly operate also other business models which require that license as well. And just looking at the non-investment types, of course, most of donation and reward-based crowdfunding do not need a license for their operation. Some do, and this is often in combination if they operate donation and reward-based models together with equity license, for instance. We also asked platforms whether they find the current regulations adequate, and you have to keep in mind that this is the time of sampling these platforms is from spring to summer of last year. This was when a lot of the equity and lending platforms were thinking about transitioning into the ECSP regime. So this is a little bit the background here. So this is the last time actually before the ECSP regulation comes into full force, where we can have this overview of how the platforms perceive the license. And here what is quite interesting is as well is that when you look at the different type of licenses, for instance, those which have received a national license from a non-financial authority, those predominantly find the regulation as adequate. However, when we look at the bespoke national crowdfunding license, there's still a few platforms which think that this is not accurate. But if you look at the combined numbers, for instance, of somewhat agree and agree, you see that more than 50% predominantly think that the bespoke national license, crowdfunding license, is better than the existing national license from a non-financial authority. And when we look at those predominantly lending platforms which use the traditional financial institutions license, here you can clearly see that the market is sort of split. About 47% are fully in agreement that this license serves them really well. And this will be interesting when we look at how they value the changes under ECSP. And then the other half of the market is somewhat, not satisfied with that license and thinks it's too burdensome to obtain this license. So that's quite interesting because it also explains a little bit the results on the next slide.
So, sorry for interfering. It's just important to highlight that the consumer lending platforms are mostly the ones that have issues with the non-existing.
Exactly. Yeah, I was just going to come to that because the consumer lending platforms currently are outside of the ECSP regulations, but in many other countries where they need to have a national license, then they need to rely on licenses which would apply for traditional finances, and that is often quite burdensome and doesn't apply to the business model and to the digital operation of these consumer lending platforms. One of the questions we ask all platforms is whether consumer lending should be then included in the ECSP. I mean, when we asked this question, this was still open policy debate. Now it's pretty much solved because we have an answer with the Consumer Credit Directive, and we know that the regulation for consumer lending is going to change in similar ways as ECSP for equity and and business lending. So in that sense, our respondents already indicated that this would be a way forward to give them regulatory certainty. Then two things which are related to sort of the market as a whole. It was quite interesting that majority of the platform said we need to increase the limit from 5 million to above 5 million, which is where it currently is, and also agree with increasing the threshold for individual investments. Of course, in the ECSP, the 1,000 euro threshold is not that fixed. The 5 million euro is fixed, and we will see how the offering by the platforms, whether they're gonna, whether this kind of ceiling is actually a big problem, because the market is now adapting to these two ceilings. So when by the end of 2024 we have the full data set available on ECSP offerings, then we can actually also evaluate whether or not the market is capable of doing offerings above 5 million euros. However, when we look at our respondents now, we can clearly see that there is definitely going to be a demand, at least from the platform side. And then what is quite interesting is also that the ECSP regime has a more flexible approach to allowing also investors to invest higher amounts. There is an investor knowledge test and other prerequisites to be done. And here, majority of platforms agree that this kind of flexible system is helpful and useful and should also be continued in the future. When we look at whether or not this ECSP is easily to be transported passported into other European countries, a lot of the platforms agree with the fact that this is easy. However, we have to keep in mind that at the time when we were sampling the platforms, still a lot of people were in the process of obtaining the ECSP license, and therefore have not started operating the ECSP license yet. So I think one of the follow-up questions will be whether now platforms are more happy with the ECSP license and the implementation on the ground. And then, unsurprisingly, for AML and anti-terrorism, I think a lot of platforms are convinced that the requirements are already quite strict, and serve the purpose. Therefore, here it was clear that the platforms rather would prefer to keep it as they are, or even make them less stricter. We also looked at whether or not the licensing makes a difference in business volumes, because you would expect that consumers, both on the demand as well on the supply side, would look for licensed platforms to ensure that the whole financing process is safer and more reliable. And we can see this also in the data that licensing by itself supports higher business volumes. But of course, this is a little bit sort of a bias also maybe in the sample, because those platforms which already have a higher business volume, they also have higher incentives to be regulated and obtain the necessary licenses. Therefore, there's not maybe a causal relationship here, but clearly at least a statistical relationship.